This story begins in an ordinary city. The day was not very good, and then a torrential rain suddenly fell on the city J. In the middle of the crowd stood an ordinary guy, Lee Horan. His parents died during the battle between the evolved and mutated beasts when he was only 6 years old. Since then, he and his sister have lived with all their relatives. However, they still grew up in a cold and cruel environment. And even in spite of all this, one should never forget that food comes alone. In this world, there is a mutation disease, a special illness that is carried by mutated beasts. Some people are unable to withstand the harmful influence of creatures from other worlds. The disease leads to complete paralysis and death. The disease develops at a different pace in everyone, from a couple of days to 8 years, and Lee Horan received this diagnosis. No matter how you look at it, there is no salvation, no chance of survival, facing inevitable death. Lee Horan lost all hope, but wanting to somehow help his sister and fulfill his mother's last wish, he decided that he would never give up. Let's fast forward a few days. Lee Horan signed up for one of the squads. The captain waited for everyone to gather and began the briefing. A few days ago, dozens of first-level mutated beasts appeared here, and they attacked the locals, so they must find their nest and naturally eliminate any threat. This guy's name is Chen, nicknamed Lightning Wind. He is the captain of this squad, and his evolution level is the highest steel. Now he says that the first-level beasts do not pose any threat to their team, so if they all follow his orders, they will return home by evening. Having finished explaining the details of the mission, he loudly declared that it was time to get down to business. The captain looked at our hero and said that the guy was the only one on their team who hadn't evolved, so they would have him as a carrier of things. Lee Horan agreed with the idea that an ordinary person could only join the hunting party as a porter. Fighting was not his job, so he would just follow them around and keep an eye on the supplies. And after the battle, Lee Horan would have to collect useful materials from the beasts. Lee Horan looked at the captain with confidence and declared that this was not his first sortie. A few minutes later, the squad had already encountered monsters. Lee Horan watched them fight and thought that it seemed like the hunt was going well and they would quickly deal with it, because there was a huge gap in strength between humans and evolved ones. Suddenly, Lee Horan looked down and noticed that the earth was shaking strangely. Lee Horan quickly realized that the first-level beasts were not so big that the earth would shake, and there was something dangerous here. Just as Lee Horan was thinking about this, a titanic snake of the 5th level appeared from the earth. The guys from the squad immediately began to tremble with fear, because they had only seen such a creature on TV. Lee Horan noticed that they had frozen in place and shouted very loudly that they needed to run away while they were all still alive. The entire squad immediately rushed to run, thinking that they were so scared that they couldn't even take one step. But someone's scream brought them to their senses. One of the squad members ran up to the captain and said that the snake was too fast to avoid, so it needed to be distracted by something, because snakes stop when they eat. As soon as the captain heard this, he immediately appeared in front of our hero, and he pierced him with his blade. Lee Horan looked at the squad captain with frightened eyes and asked why. The captain grabbed our hero by the throat, saying that he was the only incapacitated member of their squad, so he could easily be replaced. After these words, the captain slowly lifted our hero up, holding him by the neck, and said that there is no better bait here. He also added that he read our hero's dossier, and he was recently diagnosed with the same disease, so he won't live long anyway. But at least this way he will save a few people. After that, he threw our hero straight to the snake and shouted loudly that Lee Horan was to blame for not being able to defend himself. Lee Horan fell to the ground right in front of the huge titanic snake, who immediately noticed her dinner. Lee Horan looked at her and thought that he would probably die like this. Suddenly, he remembered his mother's last words. She protected her children with her life, and before her death, she asked Lee Horan to promise that he would not have to look after his sister. Dying with tears in her eyes, Mom asked him to become a strong man. Memories awakened our hero's hidden abilities. A huge red beam appeared which completely engulfed our hero's village and transferred him to another world. And at the same time, he changed his clothes. As soon as Lee Horan arrived at the new place, he immediately wondered what had happened, since he seemed to have died. But now, all of his wounds had disappeared somewhere. While Lee Horan was thinking about what was happening here, he heard the voice of a girl who was incredibly happy that she was able to summon a man. I looked around and saw a bunch of girls who looked like succubi, who were discussing the fact that they couldn't even imagine that this old scroll would work. The girls pressed themselves against each other, saying that they hadn't seen such a gorgeous guy for a long time, and their blood was already boiling. After all, our hero emits an incredibly strong magical aura. All these girls began to slowly approach the guy, saying that their patience was running out. Meanwhile, Li Horan was trying to understand what was going on here and who was in front of him. He also wondered if they could see the system that had appeared as soon as Li Horan came here. Li Horan was looking at his system when he was suddenly pulled out of his thoughts by one of the succubi, who said that it was she who created the ancient summoning circle. The girl said with embarrassment that when it started working, the heavens and earth trembled in unison. And from the circle, a powerful stream of magic burst out, which is why they were very scared and decided that Li Horan was incredibly strong. The girl's name is Nico. She is a third-level beast. The girl took a few steps towards the hero and immediately said that she swears complete and unconditional loyalty to her new master. Immediately after this, Li Horan received a notification from the system that he had received the first satellite. Li Horan was surprised but quickly came to his senses and understood how the system worked. He pressed accept a new companion, and Nico's dossier immediately appeared in front of him. The level of affection is 88%. She wants to become stronger and admires the strong. Li Horan also received a notification that when the companion's affection level reached 100%, Li Horan would be able to transfer him to his harem and receive a secret reward. At that moment, Li Horan realized that he owed his reincarnation to this thing. He obtained a power superior to the evolved ones, the blood demon god system, and now he has the strength to take revenge. Li Horan was thinking about all this when suddenly Nico came close to him and asked what happened. After all, the owner had a strange expression on his face and was pointing at the air. The girl smiled and asked, "Is it because Li Horan slept too long and now his body doesn't obey him?" She asked if Li Horan wanted to move a little. Li Horan looked away and said that he didn't mind, after which the girl with loving eyes said that if he wanted to get his blood flowing, she would be happy to help and it would be a part of it for her. Immediately after this, she began to undress and talk about how she had never had anyone before. However, she does everything possible to put her master to bed. The other girls immediately began to envy and offer themselves. Suddenly, Li Horan abruptly refused and said that he had never had anything like that in mind. But as soon as he said that, the succubus's affection dropped to 85%. The girl looked down sadly and asked, "Does the owner really not like her body?" Li Horan immediately realized that he shouldn't have said that. After all, attachment is the key feature of the system, and he must use it to take revenge. Li Horan smiled. After all, he had an idea that required tying them all up to the maximum. Li Horan walked up to Nico, and with a soft smile, looked into her eyes and said that she didn't understand him. Li Horan immediately added that she was beautiful, and they were all incredibly beautiful here, and he had never seen such women in his life. Nico looked at her master with loving eyes and asked, "Is this really true?" Li Horan immediately received a notification that this girl's affection had increased by 90%, and the girl herself said that she was even a little shy. Li Horan looked down at her and said that he had just been summoned, so he was still a little out of it and needed energy. The girl thought for a while and said that if Li Horan is the blood demon god, it turns out that he just needs blood. Immediately after that, she moved her hair from her shoulders and said that Li Horan can help himself, and she will be very happy if her blood ends up inside our hero. Li Horan was haunted by the question of what just happened. These inside him, everything trembled with impatience. Are these really vampire instincts? Our heroes bared their fangs, thinking that he was no longer his own master, after which he unceremoniously sank his fangs into Nico's neck, who immediately screamed with pleasure. The attachment grew to 92%, and the girl meanwhile thought that this was simply amazing, and now she and the gentleman were one. When Li Horan got drunk, he walked away from Nico, who was shaking with ecstasy, and saw that the system said that he had only increased his strength by +1, and also received a new skill called Bloody Standing. Li Horan clicked on this skill to find out what it was. A notification from the system popped up in front of him, which said that blood fusion is a passive side effect. By absorbing a woman's blood, he gets +1 to a random characteristic, and it works. This is only once on each woman. Li Horan, as soon as he read this, was incredibly happy because these are free characteristic points, and even though they are given by chance, he has a lot of girls here, and this will be a good start. Immediately after this, Li Horan looked at Nico with confidence and declared that he needed more blood. The girl smiled, leaned over a little, and said that Li Horan could indulge himself in anything and drink as much as he wanted. Li Horan smiled and said that he needed not only her blood, but also the blood of others. Looking at the other succubi, Li Horan loudly declared that he needed the blood of women and the more the better. The succubi were immediately delighted when they found out that they would also get some. and were a little embarrassed because they had never done anything like this before. However, they saw Nico's reaction, so now they wanted to try it too. Lee Haoran looked at them and said that if no one objected, they should approach one by one. Lee Haoran, non-stop, without shame and conscience, pierced all these women and received dozens of bonuses to characteristics. The girls after his bite fell from there with pleasure and said that they had never had anything like this. And despite the fact that it hurt a little bit from the bite, however, their hearts were about to jump out of their chests. They also discussed how they now felt like their souls were one and that they had achieved enlightenment. After a while, Lee Haoran breathed a sigh of relief because he had just used blood fusion on each of them and gained a whole bunch of stat points. And besides, he just bit them on the neck, and they reacted so violently. Lee Haoran received notifications that the succubi's affection was growing, and he wondered, are their bodies really that sensitive? Night had already come. Our hero was sent to a house in the city of Succubi. Under cover of night, Nico snuck into his room, and she slowly approached the master's bed. She climbed on top of her with the words that since the bite, she has not been left with an exciting feeling, so she wants to strengthen their connection. Because now that they are alone, there will be no better moment. The girl with loving eyes thought that today she would become a real club. Suddenly, she noticed that something was wrong here. She removed the blanket and saw that instead of our hero, there was a log lying there. The girl exhaled sadly and wondered, has the gentleman already found someone more important than her? Lee Haoran, meanwhile, went to the cemetery in the forest and opened the status window where he saw that he was still level 1. But after spending the whole day collecting succubus blood, he received good characteristics. So now he needs a good fight to raise his level. And then Lee Haoran will come back and take revenge. Lee Haoran came to the cemetery because it was full of dark energy, and based on his experience hunting in the squad, it can be said that there should definitely be undead here, and if he releases his magical energy, it will attract their attention. As soon as Lee Haoran released his energy, he immediately heard a voice. Ghosts appeared before him and asked who had disturbed their peace. By a mysterious coincidence, all the signs were girls. They immediately rushed to attack our hero. However, Lee Haoran easily fought back and asked, could it be that they were only first level? After this question, the others immediately pounced on him. However, it was not a problem for our hero to fight such weak ghosts. By defeating them, Lee Haoran received experience points and finally increased his level, receiving 5 attribute points that he could spend at his own discretion. However, Lee Haoran did not stop and continued to attack the ghosts, getting more and more experience points. And finally, after an hour of this fight, Lee Haoran obtained a new skill called Beaver Flash. Now Lee Haoran can make 2 quick dashes every 5 seconds. After dealing with his opponents, Lee Haoran finally understood what the evolved humans felt. And this is simply amazing. In the midst of the defeated ghosts, Lee Haoran opened his system and found out that he had reached the 8th level. Lee Haoran decided to throw everything into strength and endurance. Suddenly, he received a notification that danger was approaching. Lee Haoran immediately looked back, and he saw in front of him a mutated beast of the 2nd level, nicknames. Lee Haoran immediately jumped back, because despite the fact that he didn't look like it, the butcher was quite fast. Lee Haoran dodged another blow, thinking about what exactly the faceless ghosts were now green. This meant that they were not a threat to him, but this butcher was yellow, which probably meant that they were about the same level. Lee Haoran looked into his opponent's eyes with confidence and thought that fate had given him a second chance, and no matter who stood in his way, he was not going to lose. But just as Lee Haoran thought about this, a second butcher immediately appeared. The butchers continued to strike, but Lee Haoran easily dodged them. After one of Lee Haoran's dodges, he tried to strike, but nothing happened. Just when Lee Haoran thought that he couldn't defeat them with his bare hands, he was immediately tied up. However, Lee Haoran used the dash to escape. Lee Haoran thought that it was quite close. After all, they were attacking at the same time and covering each other. But at least the good news was that Lee Haoran took out the broken iron sword. And despite the fact that this blade was so-so, Lee Haoran was ready to enter the duel. Lee Haoran, using his new blade to parry the attack of the huge monster, knew that he had put almost all of his points into strength, and in a direct confrontation, he was clearly not weaker. After that, Lee Haoran easily used dash and appeared in the air. And he stuck his iron blade into the head of one of the butchers. Lee Haoran immediately received a notification that he was now level 10. And Lee Haoran was surprised when he realized that he was given 2 levels at once and realized that the stronger the enemy, the more interesting the battle and more experience. Li Horan also received a new skill and at level 10, Blood Burial, summons a bloody swamp in the selected area, which slows down enemies and deals damage to him. Li Horan descended from the first corpse and went to the second butcher to destroy it. Li Horan noticed that his name was now green, which meant that they were no longer his rivals. Li Horan easily dodged the blows, saying that he had fought little, but had seen plenty of battles. And such attacks are easy to guess. Immediately after these words, Li Horan used his new skill. A bloody swamp appeared under the feet of this huge monster, which immediately attacked him. And it was a fatal attack. Li Horan received a notification that his level had increased again. Li Horan looked at all this with the thought that of course he read what this skill does, but seeing it in person is a completely different matter, and it is a pretty tough thing. While Li Horan was thinking about this, he received a new title, Undead Slayer. Now Li Horan gets plus 5% damage against the undead when the title. Having finished off the remaining ghosts, Li Horan noticed that it was already dawn, and he thought that it was dangerous. But in one day he had already advanced very far, and the risk was definitely justified. At this rate, Li Horan would become faster and stronger than that very freak who had killed him. While Li Horan was thinking about this, he also received a new notification that a daily quest was available to him, and it needed to be completed within the specified time frame. Li Horan thought that on the other hand, there is no such thing as an extra reward and accepted this task. He learned that he needed to absorb the blood of at least one creature of the opposite sex before the next dawn. Li Horan was surprised and wondered what kind of task this was. Could this really be the conventions of a vampire's life? And the punishment for failure to complete it was 5 points, which was somehow unprofitable. Li Horan looked at the tasks and thought about what he should do now. After all, yesterday he drank the blood of all the succubi in the village, and today he received such an unpleasant task. After all, it would be difficult to find a woman in this wilderness. Suddenly, Li Horan suddenly realized that there was actually a woman here. Li Horan looked at one of the ghosts he had recently defeated. After that, Li Horan slowly walked up to her, sat down, and began to talk about how she was of course the ghost that he killed. However, they were still women. Li Horan tried to bite her. However, he immediately received a notification that the target's blood was already rotting and the blood fusion did not work. Li Horan sadly thought that perhaps too much time had passed. After that, he went up to another girl, picked her up and thought that there were a lot of them here and he wanted to go with one. This should work. However, the blood fusion did not work on any of them. I somehow understood that they are not even fresh and their blood in principle cannot be fresh. Li Horan reproached himself for swallowing the blood of all the succubi yesterday and not thinking ahead. After that, he shouted loudly throughout the forest that he needed a woman. Nico, meanwhile, was basking in her master's bed, thinking that his scent was still here and that she was lying in his arms. Suddenly, she felt something and immediately realized that the master needed her now. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a huge SUV slid down the road. Inside sat 2 men in suits. The red-haired one said that they had been riding here all day, but they hadn't found anything yet. To which the second one replied that they had detected an energy surge here yesterday, and despite the fact that it was very short, it had come from exactly here. The guy also added that the energy is very unique, and apparently this is an extremely rare mutated beast, and if they can capture it, they will definitely get a promotion. The redhead replied that they actually didn't know anything about it, and if there really was something strong there, they would have a hard time. The woman who sat behind him said that cowardice is not becoming of the employees of their company, and they should move in spite of fear. To which the red-haired man replied that he apologized to the boss and was just a little worried if she did not say where they were going. The girl with white hair replied that her people don't have to worry about it here as long as nothing happens here. Her name is Rose, and she is the leader of the 4th team of the Hongcheng Evolved Companies. The girl looked at the driver and said that they were clearly not the only ones who detected this energy, but they had to be the first there. When suddenly this truck ran into our hero, Li Horan was surprised when he saw the people in front of him and immediately wondered if there was a woman there. The agents immediately got out of the car and told each other that, according to the instruments, they were looking for this very person. However, surprisingly, his magical energy was too weak. Li Horan was immediately upset by these words and realized that these guys were probably hunting him. But suddenly Rose got out of the car. She smiled and said that apparently it was a vampire, and it was quite unusual. After that, she said that it was a pity that it was only the 2nd level, because she didn't even want to get her hands dirty on it. She closed her eyes and ordered him to take it and put it in the trunk, after which they would leave. Li Haoran looked at the living woman with admiration and thought that at the moment he had no chance against her because she had golden Iran. Li Haoran noticed that even her subordinates had orange signs above their heads, which meant that they were serious opponents. But Li Haoran was not going to give up. Li Haoran used the fish to get behind the rose. She was surprised when she realized that he could do this, and Li Haoran meanwhile grabbed her by the waist. But for a second, Li Haoran paused, because this was new to him. Meanwhile, the others began to shout for Li Haoran to let this woman go. Rose was confused by such actions and asked how to understand this, and why the vampire was hugging her. Li Haoran asked for forgiveness and said that he had no other choice, after which he bared his fangs, and he plunged them into the Rose's neck. Rose closed her eyes and quietly said that she had never been touched by a man before, after which she immediately used her abilities and threw our hero away. Li Haoran was surprised by how strong she was, but when he came down to the ground, he said that he hadn't done anything like that in principle, and then asked, "Does he really deserve such a cold attitude?" Rose slowly approached him and asked him what he thought, because he not only dared to touch her, but also left a mark on her neck. The girl touched her wound and said that this was simply unforgivable. It was just that. However, Li Haoran received a notification that the Rose's affection had increased to 30%. Li Haoran smiled and said that he saw a cold woman with a soft heart in front of him. Hearing this, the girl became embarrassed and ordered him to stop talking nonsense if he was wrong. However, Li Haoran realized that everything was as he said, and she was not going to kill him. This meant that he still had a chance to escape. Suddenly, Li Haoran noticed something approaching him at high speed. To our surprise, Rose protected our hero. She grabbed the strange map and asked who was there. The people from the shadows said that the woman could calm down. After all, they didn't come to make her delirious. It was the other hunters who said that they noticed that she was hesitant to attack. So they decided to help and also added that if she didn't need Li Haoran, then it would be better to leave him to them. Li Haoran was clearly not happy that there were 2 more red titles here, and it seemed like today was not his day. However, unexpectedly Rose said that he was not going to leave our hero to them. After which she pointed her thumb at him and said that they were the first to find him and would not give him to an elite center. Li Haoran immediately smiled and replied that only a beautiful, noble woman was worthy of taking him, and the 2 of them were unworthy. Hearing this, the girl was a little embarrassed. Li Haoran received a notification that her affection had increased to 40%, and then said flatly that Li Haoran belonged to them, and this was not discussed. Li Haoran started shouting that it was simply amazing, and in terms of fighting spirit, they had already lost to Rose immediately after that. Affection increased by another 5%, which made Li Haoran quite happy. Li Haoran looked at the workers and said that these guys also looked strong and they would hardly lose to these 2 clowns. The black man said sadly that the negotiations had apparently failed, after which they immediately rushed into the attack. However, Rose easily fought off these ridiculous attacks. She instantly used her skill called Blizzard, and everything around was covered in snow. The guy with green hair thought that this was a rather unpleasant skill because the wind was blowing so hard that he couldn't even keep his eyes open. The black woman, meanwhile, said that she was limiting their mobility and at the same time creating a convenient battlefield. This meant that they were facing a truly worthy and intelligent opponent. Meanwhile, Rose noticed that her snow was melting before reaching the boy. After this, Rose jumped up and ordered to watch our hero. Once on top, the girl used her main skill. It was a huge Rose who was going to seal these 2. Rose's assistants were delighted because, in their opinion, she had hit the mark. The guy with green hair was frozen alive. His friend said that he didn't even understand how to explain this to his father, since the boy lost to a woman. Rose came down and asked what was wrong. Were they really underestimating her? The black man looked into her eyes and said that perhaps she didn't quite understand the current situation. Rose looked at her subordinates who had been hit by arrows, causing them to turn to stone. Chernish was also surprised because he didn't expect another side to appear. It was Nico who was very happy when she finally found her owner. Li Haoran called her smart and asked how she ended up here. The girl answered with a smile that she felt that the master was needed. Well, she flew in because she was ready to do everything for him. Li Haoran smiled and replied that he was very lucky with his companion. Rose watched what was happening and did not understand why she was angry. She really didn't understand why their flirting irritated her so much, but she decided that she wasn't that petty and was only angry because someone turned her people into stone. The girl ordered everyone to shut up and return the 2 to normal. However, a black guy immediately appeared in front of her and said that she should not be distracted because he would not let her go so easily. Immediately after these words, he hit her and threw her away from him. Lee Horan was surprised when he saw the true power of the Supreme Gold and realized that they had no chance against this guy. Meanwhile, Chernish was already approaching our hero, and Lee Horan was thinking about how the system had told him that he would receive a secret reward and would have to take risks. Nico was thinking that she would never abandon her master. Meanwhile, Chernish slowly approached and said that he came here for a rare beast. However, it looks like a succubus comes with it, and he is incredibly lucky today. The guy smiled and said that they don't have to be afraid because he will do everything quickly and they won't even feel anything. Immediately after these words, she rushed into the attack and fired arrows at him. However, the guy easily fought them off and called her a loser. He appeared right in front of her in order to grab the girl. However, Lee Horan suddenly appeared for a split second, after which he instantly disappeared along with her. Chernish immediately wondered where they had disappeared to and whether the insignificant second-level beast had managed to escape from him. Lee Horan Braided thought that he had spent his flashes and had nowhere to run. Therefore, he needed to quickly get the secret reward. Lee Horan also did not understand why Nico's affection had not grown. They were leaving. This would take some time. Nico, with an embarrassed face, replied that she was too useless and Mr. Come to save everything. Lee Horan bowed to her and said that it was not the time to ask for forgiveness, after which she kissed her tenderly. The girl felt good, and she quickly threw away the thoughts that now was probably not the time to do this with the gentleman. After all, her master certainly knows what he needs to do. After this kiss, Lee Horan received a notification that Nico's affection had increased to 99%. Chernish witnessed this scene and froze in shock, after which he got angry and called them animals who came running just to kiss. The guy started using his abilities to the fullest and talking about how they would pay for it. Lee Horan, meanwhile, was annoyed because he was only 1% short. Suddenly, they were covered by some strange protective barrier. It was the Rose's ability. The guy looked at her and said that he spared the girl only for diplomatic reasons, to which she replied that he simply couldn't kill her. She looked confidently into the eyes of her new opponent and declared that this vampire was hers, and she would not give him up without a fight. Rose and Chernish clashed in a fierce battle, while Lee Horan and Nico, meanwhile, reached their final form. Because the master kissed Nico in the heat of battle, the affection finally rose to 100%. Lee Horan, meanwhile, received a secret reward that can only be used once, Bloodthirsty Beak. When used, Lee Horan will gain all ability stats and the Blood Demon God's unrivaled might, lasting for 10 minutes. Lee Horan immediately used it. Rose and Chernish could not believe that such a powerful surge of energy happened in front of them. Lee Horan, meanwhile, looked at his opponent indifferently. Chernish tried to understand where such a terrifying power came from in the second level. Lee Horan slowly raised his hand and said that he had already given him a chance. Chernish's body did not obey, which is why he succumbed to this magic. Lee Horan grabbed him by the throat. The guy started screaming that he admitted he was wrong and begged not to be killed. Lee Horan looked him in the eye and said that he used to speak completely differently. Chernish, out of breath, said that he didn't know what a strong monster he had encountered and apologized for his stupidity. Lee Horan looked at all this and said that the scene looked quite familiar, because just recently he was in the place of his opponent, a piece of trash that could be painlessly disposed of. Lee Horan racked his brains and said that if he remembered correctly, that guy was from their group. Immediately after these words, he threw the blackie away from himself. However, he immediately appeared in front of him and struck, sending him into a deep knockout. Chernish barely regained consciousness lying on the ground. Lee Horan, meanwhile, looked at his new body and thought that the power of the Blood Demon God was simply amazing. Rose also looked at our hero and wondered if this was the same vampire who was there a minute ago, if he had been hiding his terrifying power all this time and succumbing to it. Nico looked at her master with loving eyes and thought that he was simply amazing. The guy with green hair, meanwhile, was finally able to destroy the ice. He slowly stood up and said that these tricks surprised him. However, now he will show his true strength and fight seriously. But he froze for a second when he saw our hero. Lee Horan, meanwhile, lifted his cloak and activated the Scarlet Storm skill. The bats pounced on the guy with green hair, and after a few seconds only one skeleton remained of him, who immediately fell to the ground. Lee Horan received a notification that his level had increased several times. Lee Horan, meanwhile, looked at the system, which told him that he had obtained a new skill, Scarlet Storm, which summons a flock of bats that deal massive damage. Chernish begged for mercy, but Lee Horan said that he could not hear anything. Chernish shouted that he didn't want to die, and that his father was the head of the elite center, and if Lee Horan let Chernish go, he would do anything. Lee Horan raised his hand and said that if the guy wanted to go home, he would help him. Chernish immediately began to thank the vampire and say that he knew that Lee Horan was a great man. Lee Horan smiled and replied that one good deed a day was his creed, after which he threw Chernish into the air with all his might. Rosa and Nico looked at this with the thought that there was a city in that direction. Chernish broke through several rocks with his body and crashed right into the building of the Elite Center, from which he died instantly. Lee Horan understood this because he received a notification that his level had increased several times. Lee Horan thought about what he would gain more, and realized that it seemed like with each level he needed more and more experience. After that, Lee Horan looked at the remaining women. Rose's legs buckled, and she asked what Lee Horan was going to do. Could it be? Now it's her turn? Lee Horan slowly approached and said that he needed Nico's help because he had come up with something. Rosa tried to understand that he wanted to involve her, and Nico immediately replied that she agreed to everything. Lee Horan used something called soul resonance. The girl looked down in confusion and asked what was happening, because it seemed to her that energy was gathering in her chest and something was about to come out. Lee Horan replied that there was now a blade in it. The girl said that it was very big and did not understand how it fit in there. Immediately after these words, a huge vampire blade burst out of her chest. Lee Horan slowly pulled out his blade from her body and said that Nico didn't have to worry. As soon as he took it out, he immediately raised it on his head with the thought that the resonance of the soul can only be activated when the attachment of the companion reaches the maximum, and this skill allows you to summon special equipment using the body of the companion. And now, Nico has given him a bloody blade. Rose looked at the blood blade in surprise and asked what just happened. She thought that Lee Horan was able to destroy her without the blade. Did he really summon the blade just to mock her? Lee Horan understood what she was thinking, swung her blade, and ordered her to stop making up stories. From this swing, all of Rose's clothes were torn. The girl immediately screamed that this was too much and said that if Lee Horan wanted to kill her, then go ahead. Lee Horan looked at her and said that he was just checking his weapon, and if she didn't want to end up like the others, then she should follow him. There was something they needed to discuss here. They went to the Forest Club, and Rose tried to understand what Lee Horan wanted to talk about and why he was always silent. Suddenly, strange thoughts began to creep into her head, that he wanted to do something indecent. She thought that he spared her then and did not kill her now only for one reason. She looked into the eyes of our hero with the thought that he fell in love with her at first sight and wants to use her body, because only demonic energy gives away the vampire in him. Otherwise, he is an ordinary person, and if you think about it, he is quite handsome. In her imagination, Lee Horan was already taking the initiative over her, and she was not at all against it. Lee Horan slowly approached her and pressed her against the tree. The girl looked at this and thought that her first time would be with a vampire, and it just didn't fit in her head. Lee Horan leaned over her and ordered her to swear allegiance. She asked if this was some kind of role-playing game. Lee Horan paused for a moment and said that he didn't allow her to ask questions. The girl looked away and swore allegiance. Lee Horan immediately received a notification that he had just received a new companion. Rose, 24 years old, affection 45%, description, strong competitive spirit, high combat performance. At first glance, it may seem that she is a very cold person, but in fact, the most loving part of her heart loves dominant men. Lee Horan leaned over a little more and said that he was completely satisfied. The girl, meanwhile, was thinking that they were too close and that he would probably kiss her now. She closed her eyes and thought about how she knew it would all end like this. However, Lee Horan suddenly pulled away from her and said that time was up and there would be no more rewards. The girl was surprised, but she looked at him and asked if that was all. Lee Horan replied that her subordinates would soon come to their senses and she could take them with her. Finally, he told her not to tell anyone about him. After which he said goodbye and went about his business. But an unexpected girl asked him in a quiet voice to stop for a second. Lee Horan looked at her in surprise and asked what was needed. The girl covered her body and said that if her subordinates saw her like this, it would be awkward, so she asked for clothes. Lee Horan gave it to her first, and the first thing she noticed was that it was still warm and smelled like our hero. Because of this, the attachment increased to 50%, and the Rose thought that she would now die of shame. It was getting dark, and Lee Horan returned to the Succubus village. He went into his house, lay down on his bed, and said loudly that a lot had happened today, and that he had not only reached level 21, but had also unlocked a bunch of skills, and he was incredibly pleased to be getting stronger. Unexpectedly, Lee Horan received a notification that since he had reached level 21, He was now able to participate in the bloody massacre. Lee Haran asked for a description, and the system popped up a window that said that during the battle in the arena, Lee Haran would not receive experience. The injuries he received would not be restored automatically, neither when leveling up nor when leaving the battle, and for passing the test, he would receive significant rewards. Lee Haran thought that his wounds would not be healed even if he won, and serious wounds could affect the speed of his development. In general, Lee Haran was not against it. However, if you think about it, it would be better to pump up first, but he immediately thought that he was already impatient. Lee Haran stood up with full confidence and accepted the bloody massacre. After all, according to him, whoever doesn't take risks doesn't drink champagne, and he is completely ready for any risks. When Lee Haran entered the portal, he noticed that he had even been given special clothing for this event. However, he immediately noticed that this place didn't look much like an arena. Immediately after that, a system appeared in front of him that said that Lee Haran was now in the preparation room and he needed to choose his weapon. Lee Haran looked around, looking for a weapon. Different daggers and blades gave different characteristics. Lee Haran took one of the daggers and thought that weapons increase characteristics and any of them would help him a lot. But he had never fought with either blades or axes. So what should he do now? Suddenly Lee Haran saw something absurd. A yellow cucumber. It was written that it does not give any bonuses. However, when it hits an enemy, it causes a short-term spasm. Lee Haran immediately took it and said that it is an excellent weapon. And despite the fact that its shape is certainly strange, the special effect is very useful, and this weapon only needs a little imagination and it will reveal itself to its fullest. After that, a system appeared in front of him that said that Lee Haran should choose a boost before the fight. 3 icons appeared in front of him. The first is defense penetration. Every time Lee Haran strikes, it lowers the target's defense by 1%. Yes. The second is a potion. Lee Haran turns out I eat instantly, restoring 30 health when used. Well, and also Lee Haran can get a random item. Lee Haran looked at all this and held back because he needs to turn off the boost. Although he doesn't even know who he will fight, and if his experience won for some reason and taught him to always take a percentage reduction in armor. Lee Haran instantly chose defense penetration and received a notification that he had activated the buff and would be transported to the Bloody Eyelash Arena. A second later, Lee Haran was already in the arena. He looked back and thought that she looked rather sinister. Suddenly, he heard the voice of one of the skeletons who loudly shouted that he welcomed a new participant to the first level of the Bloody Massacre. The skeleton explained that there were 50 levels in the arena, and each of them had its own defender, and Lee Haran would receive rewards for defeating the defender after the end, and they would definitely not disappoint him. After that, the skeleton evaporated, and in its place appeared a girl with bat wings on her head. She smiled and said that she was now the official commentator of the Bloody Massacre. Lee Haran thought that this all looked too unnatural. The commentator, meanwhile, raised her hand up and said that now they would meet a first-level defender from the Dark Forest, a sorceress representing evil omens and death. The first opponent entered the arena. Lee Haran immediately asked why she was crying. The girl with pale skin replied that she is a messenger of hell and feels the end of all mortals, and when death appears somewhere, she follows it and mourns those whose time has come to an end. Her name is Banshee. The girl looked at our hero with tears in her eyes and said that she felt a strong aura of death surrounding him, which is why she was crying. Lee Haran looked at her in surprise and asked, "Is he really going to die soon?" Inside, he was thinking that there was no health or level indicator above her, which meant that the arena was restricting some of the system's functions. Lee Haran immediately used one of his skills, thinking that it didn't matter because now he knew what kind of strength he had. A bunch of bats immediately pounced on Banshee. However, she easily defeated them and said that such a simple trick would not take her, and added that Lee Haran was no match for her, after which she immediately pounced on him and appeared behind him, saying that it was all over. Lee Haran suddenly jumped up and asked, "Does she really have no idea about tactics?" After which Lee Haran replied with a smile that if he couldn't defeat her in a long-range fight, then he just needs to move to the near one. The girl looked at the weapon in the hands of our hero, and then she pushed him away, shouting for him to take that thing away from her. With this blow, she knocked the cucumber out of his hands. The commentator immediately shouted loudly that Lee Haran had just dropped his strange weapon and also added that it seemed like Banshee had a strong aversion to oblong objects. The commentator also added that Lee Haran was able to turn this situation to his advantage and fixed her in a very peculiar position. Banshee cried and thought that she could not escape and did not understand what was happening. She wondered how Li Horan was stronger than her. Li Horan tripped her and knocked her to the ground, also adding that he didn't expect his weapon to have such an effect since she lost control just by looking at him. Li Horan looked into her eyes and told her to give up, because he would not lose to anyone against brute force, and she would definitely not be able to escape anywhere. After that, Li Horan leaned over a little, which made the girl blush, and Li Horan replied that it was probably uncomfortable for her and suggested that they give in and that it would be easier for both of them. But Banshee used her scream to push our hero away. She pinned him to the wall. Li Horan slowly returned, but many thought that this was a rather powerful skill, and it definitely should not be underestimated. The commentator, meanwhile, was shouting that the Banshee was using her signature skill called Howl, and the heart of any enemy hearing their own is filled with primordial horror. Seized by fear, the enemy loses any will to fight and drowns in the abyss of death. If our hero does not have enough strength of spirit, he will not be able to withstand this attack. Li Horan covered his ears, and the commentator shouted that, as she thought, it was very difficult for him, and it seemed like the outcome of the battle had already been decided. Suddenly, Li Horan found himself inside his head. In front of him was her mother, who said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Li Horan asked in surprise, "Is she really alive?" A replied that she was surprised at how her son had grown. Our hero's mother extended her hand and said that she wanted to hold hands so that they would always be together. Li Horan took a few steps forward, and his mother spoke about how eternal bliss awaited them, in which they would always be together. But suddenly Li Horan stopped and hid his hands in his pockets. The woman looked at him in surprise and asked what he was waiting for, why he didn't take her hands. Did he really not miss her at all? Li Horan closed his eyes and replied that he had already experienced death once. He was betrayed, stabbed in the back, left to be torn apart by a beast. He fell ill with an incurable fatal disease, and, when he was still very young, he somehow miraculously survived, finding himself in the midst of a clash between mutated beasts and evolved people. Li Horan opened his eyes and loudly declared that his mother had given her life to save his sister, and she would never invite him to the afterlife with her. With his willpower, Li Horan broke free from this illusion. Banshee looked at this and said that this simply couldn't be. Li Horan took out his cucumber, and the commentator meanwhile said that this is simply amazing. Li Horan dealt with Voy, and he is clearly not so simple, and the fight is becoming more and more interesting. Li Horan used his skill called Hidden Blood Art, and disappeared, saying that he had figured out his opponent's strength, and it was his turn to attack. When Li Horan disappeared, Banshee was surprised and wondered if he could really hide so well. She used her howl again. Only this time, it was aimed and covered the entire arena with it. The commentator shouted loudly that this technique was even more terrible than the previous one. Running around with a chaotic attack covering the entire arena was incredible, and it didn't matter whether they were visible to you or not. There was no escape from it. However, Li Horan was already very close, and suddenly he stuck a cucumber into Banshee's mouth. Li Horan lowered her defense by 1% and said that he was already tired of listening to her screams. Meanwhile, the commentator happily announced that Li Horan had interrupted Banshee's attack. Li Horan pulled the cucumber out of her mouth and declared that the fight was not over yet, because the most interesting part was yet to come. Li Horan started waving his cucumber like a madman. He was constantly lowering her defenses. The girl was thinking that our hero had an ordinary cucumber in his hands. So where did such strength come from, and why did you say the attack was becoming more and more painful? She was already starting to scream in pain. However, Li Horan interrupted her and said that he was not finished yet. Li Horan delivered the final blow and received a notification that the cucumber's additional ability had been activated, paralyzing the target. Banshee rolled her eyes, thinking that she couldn't stand it anymore, and now her body wouldn't obey her and she had some strange sensations. With a crash, she fell motionless to the arena floor, raising clouds of dust. Li Horan went down to her and asked if she was giving up. The Banshee assumed a submissive pose and said in a quiet voice that she surrendered. The commentator thought that this was just some kind of horror, and just looking at it made her shudder. Li Horan looked at her and declared that his opponent had already surrendered, so it was time to announce the results of the fight. The commentator changed for thinking, and immediately announced that Li Horan became the winner of the first level, and he deserves the right to fight in the next level. At the same time, Li Horan received resistance to the effect of +10. His resistance to mind control, poisoning, bleeding, and other status effects increased, and he can also strengthen one of his skills. Li Horan thought with a smile that these were excellent rewards, because now he not only received passive enhancement, but also skill points. This meant that he definitely came here for a reason. A system appeared in front of our hero, asking if he wanted to participate in the second level of the Bloody Massacre. Lee Haran thought that he had already received the rewards, but he had not fully recovered yet, and his pride was not doing him any good, so he needed to come back here when he had pumped up. Immediately after that, Lee Horan teleported back to the real world. But as soon as he got here, a system appeared in front of him again, which said that the owner had just unlocked a hidden passive skill called the Will of the Winner. Lee Horan was surprised that he had received another reward, and even a hidden one, and also wondered why it was activated only after leaving the arena. Lee Horan opened the description of this skill and learned that enemies damaged in the arena become his companions, and he can summon his companions outside the arena. Lee Horan was surprised and thought that now that he had leveled up, he would be able to summon an entire army. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise and thought that these sounds were quite familiar. Lee Horan slowly opened his door and walked inside his room. There sat Nico, who was sniffing his things and was in seventh heaven. When she noticed that the smell became stronger, she immediately opened her eyes, and she saw the owner in front of her who asked what she was doing here. The girl immediately turned away and replied that this was not what Lee Haran thought, and she was not doing anything strange here. After which she added that she brought him clothes because he gave the cloak to that woman, and she spent the whole night sewing a new one to fit its owner. Lee Haran stroked her head and said that now he wouldn't have to think about where to look for new clothes, and also added that he definitely wouldn't give this particular cloak to anyone. Right after that, the girl went out into the street thinking that the gentleman had just said that he couldn't live without her. And that meant that he had almost directly confessed his love and that he probably wanted her to be with him until the very end. After a whole galaxy of hard battles, Lee Horan was finally able to go to bed. Only a couple of hours later, he heard screams that orcs were attacking the village. And it was true. The orcs, led by their general, attacked the village in order to take everything that was not nailed down. They tied up the girls and wanted to take them as trophies too. Suddenly, some of them were struck by arrows and immediately turned to stone. The general immediately began to look around and ask who was here, and who dared to attack the orcs. Nico loudly declared that she didn't think that someone could ruin her morning so quickly, and added that if the general didn't want to end up the same way, he should let her comrades go and get out of here. The general looked into her eyes and said that, in his opinion, she did not understand anything, after which he asked how she was going to fight the orc army. As soon as he said this, the rest of the orcs immediately pounced on her. However, out of nowhere, Lee Horan appeared, who used the Blood Swamp, the second level which he had recently upgraded. Now it is not bound to a specific area, and the blood spikes automatically pursue targets within their attack radius, and the speed and frequency have also increased. Lee Horan went outside and asked what all the fuss was about this morning. Can he just sleep peacefully? The girl wanted to answer something, but Lee Horan asked her not to worry and said that he would deal with them. The third-level general asked why a vampire cared about succubi, after which he added that it was none of his business and that it was better for him not to get involved in this matter. Lee Haran looked at him angrily and said that he had the blood of everyone from this village in him, so the orc should take back his words. Lee Haran immediately activated the skill Will of the Victor and summoned a banshee. She immediately used her skill. Nico looked at this with a surprised face because it was really surprising that the master's familiars were also strong. When the general saw her, he said that this was just one woman, and there were at least 100 orcs here, and they were not afraid of anything. But when she used her ability on them, they immediately froze in place. Many of them killed themselves, saying that they had dishonored their ancestors. They smashed their heads, and Lee Haran gained experience as if he had killed them himself. The general fell to his knees and tried to understand what kind of voice was in her head and why he wanted to do something to himself. But unexpectedly, he was able to break through and declared that the honor of the entire orc tribe rested on his shoulders. But then Lee Horan appeared and knocked him out with one blow, and with the second blow, he forced his internal organs to spill out, after which Lee Horan opened his cloak and used Crimson Storm. The orc tried to hold on and shouted that his defense was not so easy to take, and if the woman had not intervened, he would have easily defeated our hero. Lee Horan immediately stated that the general had actually brought a crowd of soldiers here himself, so there was no time to fight him one-on-one. The banshee continued to scream, driving the orcs to thoughts of death. And a few seconds later, the general was already defeated. Lee Haran looked at all this and said that being lenient towards the enemy is being cruel to oneself, after which he used the Bloody Swamp and said that if the enemy is weak, then he must be finished off without mercy. And this is the main rule of battle. Lee Haran also received 2 level increases. Lee Haran looked at everyone who survived and asked if anyone was hurt. Nico replied that the Lord saved everyone, and also added that their ropes were a little chafed, but overall nothing serious. The succubi looked at their master with admiration and said that he looked incredibly cool in battle. And now these bastards won't even think of poking their noses in. They also added that they must definitely repay their master. Lee Horan ignored these words, walked up to Banshee, and said that she had shown herself to be excellent and had been very helpful with these orcs. The Banshee was embarrassed and replied that it was an honor for her to serve the master and she would carry out any order. Lee Horan immediately went ahead and said that he had an important task for her. When they were alone, Lee Horan immediately pierced her with his hands. The girl happily said that last night he left her in such an incomprehensible state, and today he presses her so tightly and bites her neck. Because of what she thought about his important task is to satisfy such strange desires, her face turned red, and she said that it hurts. However, for the sake of the master, she is ready to endure everything. Hours walked away from her, received a notification that he had completed the daily task, and also received a notification that this girl's affection had grown to 50%. Lee Horan wiped his mouth and said that his desire had nothing to do with it because he was a vampire who had to drink the blood of women every day to maintain his strength, and this was his natural need. Afterwards, Lee Horan noticed her strange expression and asked, "Is she anemic?" The girl, meanwhile, in a strange pose, said that after yesterday's battle her body became very sensitive and every time she sees the gentleman, yesterday pops up in her head and just now he pressed her very tightly and her body trembles on its own after that. With a red face and shame, the girl said that she could not stand it any longer and that it was impossible, after which she apologized and said that she had to take her leave. And instantly disappeared. Lee Horan thought that she was probably really too sensitive. Meanwhile, the succubi were basking in the spring. Nico was saying that the master had saved their village and they should thank him. The others answered her that it was as easy as pie, and they could thank him with their bodies in the most sincere way. After a short pause, Nico replied that it seemed to her that the gentleman was only interested in fighting, and besides, with him now there was another girl. And Nico unfortunately had no experience at all in love affairs. The girl persistently tried to understand what she needed to do in order to satisfy the master. A friend asked if Nico really thought that she was not attractive to the gentleman at all, to which Nico replied that that was probably true, since she had tried several times but nothing worked. Her friend smiled and replied that seducing a man is a basic skill of any succubus, and Nico was simply too shy. The girl raised herself slightly and said that she could help with this because she was sure that the gentleman would not be able to resist their charms. The girlfriend asked to take off her clothes, Nico obeyed, and the succubus used her spell. Now she had a strange tattoo on her body, and her friend immediately explained that thanks to this, she would be able to reveal her full potential. Meanwhile, Lee Horan was at home, thinking that the will of the winner consumed too much energy and he would need to invest in his spirit. And now he could only maintain his physical characteristics, strength and endurance at the same level. While he was training, Nico suddenly entered his room. Lee Horan looked at her and asked why she was so happy. The girl thought that she couldn't even take her eyes off him because his body was a real work of art created by forces beyond her understanding. Because of this, she even got nervous and dropped the towel. The tattoo worked on the master, however. Lee Horan immediately received a notification that his effect resistance had withstood the attack and he had avoided the effect called lustful desire. Meanwhile, the girlfriend thought that she had forgotten about one nuance. If the mark does not affect the target, then the effect is transferred to the caster. She thought that this would hardly have an effect on the gentleman, and everything turned out not very well. Lee Horan asked if Nico was okay. And what is this tattoo? Nico, meanwhile, was under the influence of lustful desire and said that now he had very dirty thoughts in his head and something inside seemed to want to break out. She asked the master for help and Lee Horan walked up to her and hugged her. Lee Horan said that he understood everything. However, she was now in a very strange state, to which the girl immediately replied that it did not matter and asked to do with her whatever her master wished. Lee Horan slowly kissed her and pressed his body against hers. The rest of the village listened to the rustling of the bed all night. The next morning, Nico suddenly got up and was surprised. She had a strange feeling as if an endless stream of energy was coming from her body, and this had never happened to her before. The girl thought for a while and decided that she probably became stronger. After that, she looked at our hero and thought that it was probably because of last night with the gentleman, because his body is really amazing. She thought that even though her tattoo didn't work, she still got along with her owner, and she would never forget that. Meanwhile, Lee Horan woke up from the notification that the companion had received the essence of the bloody demon. due to which her characteristics had greatly increased and the level of the magical beast had risen to the fourth. Lee Horn was surprised and wondered about the nutrition. Could he really do it? So, after that, he received another notification that he could activate the essence of the Bloody Demon Leaf with companions who had 100% affection, and it was activated only once with each companion. Lee Horan thought that although this effect is one time, it is really strong. And the fourth level is just crazy because now her characteristics are even higher than his. Nico looked at her master and asked what happened. Did he not like last night? To which he replied that she showed her best side. The girl smiled and replied that she was glad to serve her master. After that, Lee Horan received a daily quest notification again, which said that he had to swallow a woman's blood before the next dawn. Lee Horan thought about it and asked, "Are there any other villages nearby with women?" Nico thought about it and said that there was a village of orcs nearby who were constantly on the run to other villages, and they definitely had women. Lee Horan instantly made the decision to go there. Lee Horan also added that if he understood correctly, they had been pestering the succubi for a long time, so it was time to take revenge on them, and Nico would have to show off her new strength. Lee Horan gave her one warning, not to touch women. Nico confidently went to the village and said that she understood everything. Closed inside, she thought that the master was stealing her opportunity to take revenge, and she would never disappoint him. The rest of the orcs tried to understand what was happening outside. Nico soared into the air and declared that now the orcs would see the power that her master had given her, after which she immediately unleashed all her anger on this village. Lee Horan received experience points for every orc he killed and thought that it was simply wonderful. After all, when his companions kill enemies, the experience still goes only to him because they don't have their own system. Having caused massive damage, Nico descended to the ground. She waved her hand and said that today she had come to destroy their village in the name and will of Lee Horan, the Blood Demon. They immediately rushed to attack her. However, she easily dealt with a couple of orcs. Then she summoned a whip and said that now they would see the highest combat technique of the succubi. Having flown up, Nico stopped and a bunch of orcs immediately attacked her, which she killed without blinking an eye, while Lee Horan was receiving notifications that his level was rapidly increasing. After a few more minutes, Lee Horan finally reached level 25 and unlocked a new skill, Child of the Night. At night or in the dark, Lee Horan gains a 30% bonus to movement speed, and all his attacks inflict a bleeding effect. After reading this, Lee Horan smiled and thought that from now on, he would only fight in the dark, just like a real vampire. Meanwhile, Nico overpowered all the extras and called them a laughingstock. A female orc appeared to stand up for her village. Lee Horan immediately teleported from behind me, and he sank his fangs into her neck, completing his daily task. To sum it up, during the destruction of the orc village, Nico killed 178 enemies. In addition to this, 30 orcs were taken prisoner. Lee Horan approached her and said that she was now on a completely different level, to which the girl replied that it was all thanks to the master. Lee Horan looked at the prisoners and said that now she should have enough energy to maintain petrification for a long time. Therefore, she should take the prisoners to the village and cast petrification. After all, they will still be useful. Lee Horan thought that, although they looked peculiar, they were still women. And if they were in the Succubus village, he would not have to worry about daily quests for the next month. While Lee Horan was thinking about this, Nico approached him and said that she must have found something very rare in the village and wanted the master to accept it as a gift. Lee Horan took the strange ball, and the system immediately explained to him that he had received a rare item called a magic breath pill. By consuming this item, Lee Horan would forever get the following effect: an increase in maximum reserve energy and the ability to hide his magical energy. Lee Horan immediately thought that if he swallowed it, he would be able to return to the city and the evolved would not be able to figure him out. Lee Horan immediately ate it and confidently declared that it was time to return. The next day, after the destruction of the village, Lee Horan was about to return to the city. Nico looked at him and asked why he wanted to leave so much. Did she upset her master in some way? Lee Horan replied that he had one important matter, so he was going to leave for the Succubus village. However, he would return in a couple of days. Lee Horan said that he was leaving the banshees to the succubi and asked the two of them to clean up all the beast villages within a 10-kilometer radius and, as usual, if they found women, take them prisoner. After these words, Lee Horan said goodbye and went to the city. Let's move to the residential area of the city J. Lying in her home, Rose enjoyed the barely noticeable scent of our hero that emanated from his cloak. Rose fell asleep right on top of him. But a few hours later, she woke up from strange sounds. Looking around, she saw Li Horan sitting in front of her, training. Li Horan said good morning to her and asked, "Did he really wake her up?" Rose screamed in fear and asked how it happened that she did not notice his presence and how he found out her address. Li Horan replied that since she had sworn allegiance to him, he could now sense her location, after which he noticed that Rose's affection had risen to 63%. Li Horan looked into her eyes and said that he came here to ask for help because he needed to make inquiries about someone. Zheng, captain of the elite center. Lightning Wind. That's who interests our hero. Rose smiled and said that it would be easy as pie for her. Li Horan thought for a moment and replied that there was something else that was bothering him. Li Horan lowered his gaze and said that on a simple night, Rose fell asleep in his clothes and kept saying Li Horan's name in her sleep. The girl wanted to answer something, but suddenly the alarm clock rang. She immediately stood up and quickly walked out of the room, saying that she was late for work, and after work, she would carry out any assignment. Li Horan thought that he probably dreamed of something good. After some time, Rose reached the underground parking lot, where she thought about the fact that your hero saw her in an inappropriate form, and this is a real shame. Suddenly, two men stopped her and said that they wanted to ask a couple of questions. They were clearly first-class fighters. The guy with long hair said that a few days ago, a strange magical explosion occurred in the suburbs, and his younger brother and his partner went to investigate. But they were both killed, and the younger brother's body was dumped near the building of the elite center. The man with long hair, who had a legendary level of strength, adjusted his glasses and asked, how come his brother, who had a gold level of evolution, was killed? And Rose didn't have a single scratch. The girl thought that the situation was becoming more dangerous and asked, do they really think that she killed him? The bald guy began to flex his fists and talk about how there was no need to waste time on her without brute force. She said it more than once. He immediately rushed at her, but Rose used her abilities to defend herself, after which she asked, do the masters of the elite center really solve problems in this way? The guy with long hair smiled and asked to understand him correctly, because he is as intense as his younger brother. After that, he smiled and added that they didn't wish anything bad and just wanted to know what happened that day. The girl immediately replied that that day she saw only bones, and it was as if the spirit of the beast itself had caught a cold. After that, she was released, and she thought that now she had become a target of the elite center, and the situation was becoming more and more under control. After all, as a rule, people during their life can only reach the gold level of evolution. To break through the gold level and reach the star is beyond praise. The legendary level is even more advanced, and its owners are geniuses among geniuses, and this guy somewhere. Despite the fact that he looks elegant and soft, in fact, makes you tremble. The guy with long hair was still in the parking lot trying to cough. The bald man wanted to help with something. However, the owner of the legendary status replied that everything was fine and it was just his illness making itself known. The guy with long hair gave the order to find two subordinates with whom there was a rose that day, and if the confessions will be radically different, then the three of them will rest in peace. Meanwhile, Li Horan was at Rose's house and was constantly receiving an increase in experience points due to his familiars slaughtering the beast villages. After some time, Li Horan received a new title called Combat Officer. This means that now the characteristics of his subordinates are increased by 10%, and this status is much cooler than that of the undead killer. After a few more hours, Rose finally came back and said that she found everything about your boyfriend. She picked up some documents and replied that there were only 8 people in the squad, all of whom had a steel level, and the details of the mission, the list of squad members, skills, home address, contact phone numbers, and so on were all on these documents, and it was simply impossible to obtain more information. Li Horan looked at the documents and said that it looked like a real accounting report for their family, and he was extremely surprised that she did so well. The percentage of affection rose to 69%, and Rose, embarrassed, said that it was nothing special. Li Horan praised her again and asked what was in the suitcase, to which she replied that she decided to give a gift to her lord. Li Horan opened the suitcase and saw that there were many excellent magic recovery potions inside, and there was also a lot of equipment there. Li Horan immediately added that he had no money at all, and he did not understand why she was spending money on him for no reason, to which she replied that they had already encountered members of the elite center, and the enemy had a legendary level, so it was possible to hope that the next time, equipment and potions would at least help our hero a little. Hearing this answer, Li Horan immediately walked over to her and kissed passionately, made the Rose embarrassed, At the same time, her affection increased to 83%. A few seconds later, Lee Horan walked away from her, and the girl, with a red face from shame, thought that Lee Horan had just stolen her first kiss. Lee Horan looked at her with a smile and thanked her for all these gifts. However, now he had to study for extremely important matters. Lee Horan went outside and hid his equipment and gear from prying eyes, after which he decided to visit his younger sister. Lee Horan entered the classroom where she was taking extra classes. He was completely invisible because now it was dangerous for him to show himself in public. Lee Horan looked at her and thought that now he had to become stronger at all costs, because only in this way could he be close to his sister. The girl noticed someone's presence and looked into the doorway. She didn't see anyone there, but for some reason her tears didn't stop. Meanwhile, the lightning wind was on its mission and destroying the animals. After some time, he stood up and, pleased with himself, declared that the mission was accomplished. His assistants said that they were surprised at how strong their captain was, because even a polar bear of the highest third rank could not stop him faster than a blade. The captain asked them to stop showering them with empty compliments and said that when they had completed the work they could return home. But suddenly Lee Horan appeared and asked that no one would go home today. The captain looked at our hero and said that he was surprised that Lee Horan was alive. After all, they wounded him with a blade and left him to be eaten. Lee Horan took a few steps forward and said that nothing was impossible in this world. After that, he took a few more steps and declared that he was demanding a high price for betrayal. One of the captain's subordinates immediately came out and said that his captain sacrificed himself to our heroes because circumstances forced him to, and he did nothing wrong. And if you blame someone else, it's only your own weakness. The man also added that if Lee Horan is alive, it means that there are no more problems and there is no point in hanging around here. After that, he took out some money and said that he had a few hundred yuan lying around, and perhaps this little something would touch the soul of our hero. However, instead of answering, Lee Horan instantly appeared in front of him and swelled his head in one movement. Lee Horan looked at the others with confidence and declared that he did not need money because he had come to take lives. The captain tried to understand what he had just seen and how Lee Horan had easily defeated the guy at the steel level. Another guy immediately attacked our hero. He attacked our hero with his lightning, after which he descended to the ground, saying that this was his strongest attack, and now Lee Horan was clearly dead. But after just a few seconds, he was killed by bloody thorns. The dust cleared, and Lee Horan said that such attacks only make people laugh. Realizing that Lee Horan had some kind of power, they pounced on him in a crowd. But then Banshee appeared and instantly finished them off. Lee Horan rushed to attack and killed several more squad members. Within minutes, the field was strewn with corpses. Banshee said that she would deal with the last one now. However, Lee Horan asked her not to rush. The captain of the squad looked into the eyes of our hero with the words that he was extremely surprised. What is it that will destroy while he was able to reach such a level? However, the captain added that he had already figured out our hero's plan. And despite the fact that he tries his best to hide it, each of his attacks is accompanied by a release of energy. And besides, the girl calls him master. The squad captain pointed his finger at our hero and declared that he was not a human being at all. Lee Horan looked at him angrily and said that the captain had no right to blame anyone for this, because he himself did not really look like a human being. The captain took a few steps forward and said that Lee Horan dared to come to him for revenge because he imagined himself to be the owner of great strength comparable to excellent steel, and he was determined to kill everyone. However, Lee Horan miscalculated because after the last mission was disrupted by the Fifth Order beast, there was time to prepare. Immediately after these words, an empty syringe fell to the ground. The captain laughed and said that this was a drug from Country M, which he bought for a lot of money. And not only would its full potential be revealed, but it would also temporarily take over the ultimate level. The injection worked, and now he was at the middle of silver level. Lee Horan looked around and replied, "This promotion is just a waste of time. It's already night and the captain has no chance of winning." The captain rushed to attack and said that it made no difference whether it was day or night, because Lee Horan didn't even know how strong he was now, and even those with an intermediate level couldn't keep up with his current speed. However, Lee Horan wanted to return because of his passive skill, Child of the Night. The captain looked around and thought that it was simply incomprehensible to the mind to realize that his eyes could not keep up with our hero. As soon as he thought about it, he immediately received a blow to the back and the bleeding effect was triggered. The Banshee looked at all this and thought that her master had a chance to kill the enemy from him for nothing. He decided to stand here differently. A few more seconds later, the captain, covered in blood, screamed that he would kill our hero with his own hands. Suddenly, a blade pierced his body. After that, Lee Horan suddenly pulled it out. The captain fell to the ground and called our hero a bastard, after which he asked not to torture him but to finish him off right away. Lee Horan took out a superior recovery potion and said that he did not want to hear a prayer for mercy, after which he restored 500 health points to the captain, and then he pierced his leg with his blade. Lee Horan slowly picked him up and said that he still had a lot of these potions and every 5 seconds he would pierce his opponent with a blade so that he would experience endless pain and despair. Lee Horan looked into his eyes and said that in the last few minutes, he was going to throw him into the snake's throat. Banshee looked at all this and thought that she was right. Her master enjoyed the pain just like when he tortured her in the arena. Meanwhile, at the top of one of the towers, a secretary ran up and said that they had just detected a surge of magic. She said that although the activity was weak, it was still the same magic that the younger brother had researched, and it was located near the Chen team's mission. Meanwhile, Lee Horan found a 5th Order Titanic snake. He raised the captain's head and asked if he recognized this snake. The captain began to beg him not to do this. However, it was too late. Lee Horan threw him into the snake's throat, which immediately ate its prey. Lee Horan was surprised when the snake immediately disappeared instead of continuing the duel. After killing that guy, Lee Horan got a new skill in level 30. The new skill is heart-to-heart communication, when the affection for subordinates reaches 100%, and not to enter into symbiosis with other souls to create an exclusive skill. Lee Horan thought about how he had already seen Nico's soul respond, and although it only lasted for 10 minutes while he was at the peak of his strength, the Blood Blade was still quite powerful. And with the achievement of complete attachment, each subordinate will receive this skill, and the strength of our hero will become simply immeasurable. Suddenly, Lee Horan received a notification from the system. It said that this hero was in danger because a legendary-level object was rapidly approaching. Therefore, he needed to leave the location immediately. Lee Horan immediately gave the order to leave immediately, and after a few seconds they had already disappeared, and the legendary Master Wei arrived on the ground, but found that there was no one there. He tried to understand where they had gone. They couldn't have disappeared into thin air. While he was thinking about this, a titanic snake attacked him. The master immediately flew away, thinking that he was distracted by an ordinary 5th Order snake, and that he had no time to play with this beast. Suddenly, as he thought about it, he noticed something strange. The snake does not appear symmetrical, and she has something on the right. The master thought that she was probably just ugly and unlucky. Lee Horan was in his new space at the time, where all of his acquired equipment could be. Lee Horan thought that they were probably being pursued by the guy that the Rose was talking about, and this time he was lucky enough to escape. However, such a trick cannot be pulled off during a battle. Lee Horan realized that he was probably at the peak of his strength now, and he had to be extremely careful. In order to escape, Lee Horan used bloody slaughter, and when he arrived here, he thought that he would not be able to leave until the battle was over. Lee Horan looked around and saw that the weapon's performance had improved significantly compared to his previous brother, and the variety was truly enormous. But since he used a weapon that looked like a cucumber, anything can come in handy. Among all the weapons, Lee Horan chose the whip for love pleasures, which has an additional effect. When it hits the target, both the target and the owner enter a state of excitement, increasing each other's attack power by 1%. Lee Horan thought that this was a high-risk and reward weapon. If he could dodge the enemy's attacks, he would not lose anything. Our hero has a new option to choose a boost. Now you can call a partner. So Lee Horan decided that this would be a great option. Meanwhile, Rose was at home taking a shower and thinking, why hasn't Lee Horan returned yet? Did he run into the legendary master or did he end up in another place? However, she calmed herself down. There was no reason to worry because she had already seen his strength and there was literally nothing to worry about. And immediately after that, she was transported to the arena. She was immediately dressed and asked what kind of place this was, after which Lee Horan explained that this was arena, and he summoned her because her skills would be very useful. After this, the commentator announced that the second-level guardian is apparently Inferno, who controls flames. Inferno appeared and said that 2 against 1 is not fair. However, she still does not intend to give up and admit defeat like her younger sister. Lee Horan was immediately attacked by a fireball that had grown incredibly in size, and the power and range of this attack is literally beyond the imagination of an ordinary evolved one. Lee Horan looked at his weapon and thought that if he hit her with a whip, he would also increase her strength. And this is too easy, but the damage received in the arena is real wounds. Suddenly, Lee Horan realized something. The effect says that when hitting the target, both the target and the owner enter a state of excitement. but it doesn't say that the target must necessarily be an enemy. Inferno, meanwhile, continued to attack with huge fireballs. But the rose was able to build an ice wall and defend itself. The woman replied that what she couldn't stand most was fire. Inferno replied that it was a strange coincidence because he was sick of the ice elemental. Rose ducked down to cast her spell, but suddenly she received a blow from a whip. The girl instantly became aroused, after which she looked at our hero and asked why he hit her, to which Lee Horan replied that plans had changed and he just needed to be patient a little. Lee Horan accepted to beat her and increase her attack power by 1% all the time. The commentator tried to understand what was going on and why Lee Horan was beating up his subordinate. Inferno looked at all this and also did not understand why they were doing this in the arena. Lee Horan continued to beat his subordinate with a whip, and at the same time, the affection also increased to 90%. The girl, her face red from embarrassment and excitement, said that despite the fact that she was the boss, she had just been publicly whipped with a small whip, and of course she was in pain and ashamed. But she did not feel hostility towards it, and on the contrary, she liked it more and more. Lee Horan and his subordinate raised their attack power by 69%, after which she felt a surge of strength and rushed out. Just like that, Lee Horan also thought that he had never experienced anything like this before, and received a buff called Darkness Affinity. The movement speed at night or in the dark increases by 30%, as well as the bleeding effect. Inferno, meanwhile, was flying and talking about how they would be finished off now. The commentator wondered if Inferno was going to use his most powerful technique, and right after that, Inferno created a huge fireball. Rose replied that this was their duel and asked our hero not to get mixed up, after which she used her magic, instantly freezing the fireball and Inferno itself. The commentator said with delight that our hero's subordinate not only stopped the flow of lava, but also completely turned the tide of the fight and froze the demon Inferno. After which they announced that the winner of the battle was Lee Horan and his subordinate, and they received the right to move to the 3rd level. At the same time, Lee Horan received 1 skill point, resistance to fire, and also an offer to move to the 3rd level. Lee Horan thought that his current strength allowed him to continue the fight, but the increased excitement created difficulties because the side effects were quite severe. Lee Horan looked at his subordinate and said that she had performed quite well. Then he asked how she was feeling, to which Rose replied that she felt quite strange. She had never felt so excited, and even her legs were tingling a little. But it was quite pleasant. Lee Horan realized that she had already arrived, and if they continued to fight, he too might lose control. Lee Horan decided that Arena could wait, because now he needed to return the Rose home. When they returned back, Rose looked at her master and said that the pain in her body was becoming more and more intense, so she asked for help with a massage. The girl changed her clothes, lay down on her stomach, and said that she was ready and Lee Horan could begin. Inside, the girl was thinking that she was doing a black shock especially for this massage, because it was so soft and sliding that it caused a simply amazing sensation. Lee Horan was doing this massage and caught himself thinking that the effect of the whip had not disappeared, and on the contrary, the arousal from physical contact only increased. Rose also received pleasure as if she was high. She thought about how Lee Horan had stolen her first kiss, and now he had completely felt her. Affection had meanwhile grown to 96%. Lee Horan began to slowly undress, saying that he remembered how she said in her sleep that she wanted to make up for what she had missed in the grove, and now was the best time. Rosa looked at our hero with embarrassment and replied that she was not yet mentally prepared and just wanted a massage. Lee Horan reminded her that she couldn't speak to him informally, and the girl apologized and called him sir, and her affection increased to 98%, and finally reached 100%. Lee Horan got the opportunity to use the blood peak, and he used it. In the morning, he opened his eyes and saw Rose sitting on him. The woman looked straight into the gentleman's eyes and said that she felt just great, and he literally opened a new world to her. Lee Horan received a notification that she had activated the Blood and Demon Essence, thanks to which the experience points improved and the evolution level was raised to Star Diamond. Lee Horan smiled. After all, she had now advanced to a higher level. Since that was the case, it would be reasonable to only use this ability on people with the highest level like a Rose. Lee Horan slowly stood up and said that now the Rose also had the ability to give him a weapon, after which Lee Horan activated the Soul Resonance skill. And after a few seconds, a black crown appeared from her chest. Lee Horan immediately put it on and saw a notification from the system that it added plus to intelligence and increased magical attacks, after which the system saved and hid this item. Lee Haran said that it was time for him to return to the village and asked if Rose could lend him some money. The girl replied that it was strange to ask her for money after what happened, and added that Lee Haran could take as much as he wanted. Lee Haran took the money and dropped by the middle school before leaving the city, and also completed the daily task, after which Lee Haran slowly walked towards the village while talking about various things. Meanwhile, Rose went to the office, but despite the fact that she had to get to work, she still had only yesterday's scenes with the gentleman in front of her eyes. Suddenly, she was brought back down to earth. A secretary came up and said that her colleague had seen last night how people from the elite center took two subordinates. These subordinates were now at the elite center's plant in nature, where they were interrogated with particular passion. However, the guys didn't crack and just joked instead of answering. A few minutes later, someone knocked down the door to the elite center. Rose appeared in front of them, clearly furious. She ordered her people to be brought back immediately before she blew the factory to hell. The bald man looked into her eyes and said that behind the warehouse door there were dozens of evolved guards guarding this building. So how could she, with a gold level, get in unnoticed? To which the woman replied that they had all turned into ice cubes, after which she used her abilities and said that the same fate would befall everyone who went against her and her people. She instantly used the spell she had just recently received to attack. He defended himself with a wall of fire and declared that he was the best among the gold evolutionists and that she had no chance of winning. To which the woman replied that she was no longer who she used to be. The guy broke through and rushed forward. However, he noticed that something was hurting him. He wondered if she was now even able to control such small fragments. After which Rose snapped her fingers and ice crystals grew at the sight of the wounds. Frozen, the bald man calmly said that he had underestimated his opponent. Rose screamed that her opponent was clearly not stupid. However, he realized everything too late. After all, she now controls A and how much ice, and he is seriously injured, and it will not be difficult for her to freeze even his blood. And this means that he has already lost. The woman slowly approached her subordinates and asked him not to act rashly, and then perhaps she would save his life. However, the bald man replied that the master appointed him as his deputy because he is one of the few best evolved gold level. And the gold level woman looked down on him, and this is literally a terrible humiliation. After which he used a fiery aura and stated that it did not scare him because he could even evaporate ice in his own body. But immediately after that, new ice crystals pierced his body. Rose looked down on him and replied that his fire was too weak, and besides, she was no longer a gold-level person. The girl folded her hands and declared that she was now on star, after which she freed her subordinates and they thanked her for saving them. But suddenly the girl felt something strange. She immediately looked around, and she saw that in front of her stood a legendary level master who praised her for having reached star in just 2 days. At the same time, Lee Horan returned to the village. Now his thoughts are filled only with bloody blades. Not long ago, Lee Horan had tested it and didn't give it enough importance. However, this blade adds 100 to the level to unlock all attribute values, and the higher its level, the stronger the weapon. That's what he thought about it. He received a notification that Rose was fighting someone, which is why he was getting experience. Suddenly, Lee Horan realized something. The person who could fight her now could only be because of the elite center, which meant that she was in danger. Lee Horan jumped on Nico and ordered him to fly in the indicated direction. The girl simultaneously said that in such a situation it is quite difficult to stay focused, and she is literally at the limit. Rose entered into a fight with the legendary, but was clearly losing. She wanted to use her strongest attack when she suddenly noticed that she could not move her body at all. This is only one thing at first. This guy even knows how to control people. Even as her death approached, she thought that unfortunately she would never see the master again. But right in front of her, the one she was thinking about appeared. Lee Horan stopped this blow with one palm and said that Rose is his woman. Yes, Lee Horan used the blood peak, and now for 10 minutes he is endowed with unrivaled power. The master immediately smiled because he was glad that he could now avenge his brother and said it out loud. However, Lee Horan replied that there was no need for that, after which, with one movement, he tore off his opponent's arm. Then he looked at Rose and apologized for being late. The girl, meanwhile, with tears in her eyes, could not believe that the gentleman really came only to save her. Lee Horan threw the potion and asked to cure Rose while he killed the master. The master, holding his wound, said that the fact that he lost his arm does not mean anything because he is an incomparable genius who reached the legendary level at the age of 13. Then, for a few seconds, the world seemed to cease to exist. When this effect passed, Lee Horan saw a changed master in front of him, who said that this was his true form, the appearance of a 6-winged fallen angel. The master said that unfortunately the braid breaks its symmetry. However, this requires transformation. But now, without an arm, he has lost this defect and Li Haran will pay for the piece of his aesthetics. Swinging his scythe, the master replied that he would cleanse the world of the existence of the shameful demon. When Li Horan heard this, he received a notification from the system, which said that the target had the intention of finishing off the master. Therefore, he needed to get rid of her within 5 minutes to eliminate the risk of being killed. And after completing the task, Li Horan would also receive a special reward. Li Haran thought that he didn't even need a reward for killing this guy and rushed to attack, summoning his blood blade. The master dodged this blow and said that it was really not bad. Suddenly, the smile disappeared from his face because, with this blow, Li Haran was able to deprive the master of his arm. Instantly, he rose into the air. Li Haran thought sadly that there was less and less time left to kill him, and opening his wings, he also rose into the air. The master looked at all this with the thought that Li Haran was an idiot who had fallen into a trap, because in the sky the master was an unsurpassed fighter, and the power of the fallen angel helped him grow a new arm. Suddenly, Li Haran appeared from behind. The master was surprised but looked at him and wondered if Li Haran was really faster. Li Haran slapped him and sent him flying down. When the dust settled, Li Haran leaned over the master who was saying that his father was the president of the elite center, and Li Haran would not dare to kill such a high-ranking person. Otherwise, the entire elite of the city would become his enemies. Li Haran smiled and replied that both brothers mentioned their father before they died. After which, Li Haran swung his blade one last time and finished off the master. He gained a ton of experience points and left a huge hole in the ground. Li Haran also gained a new skill, Flow, a powerful blood strike forward. And on top of that, Li Haran completed an urgent task and received a special reward, a small blood moon. The description says that from the moment of creation, the small moon will exist for 1 hour, and during this effect, the power of the blood clan will double. Li Haran returned to his subordinates and said that the problem had been resolved. Nico immediately jumped on her owner and said that they were okay. Li Haran then looked at the rose and said that after this, she would definitely encounter an elite center in the city, so why shouldn't she go along with them? Roth confidently answered that she of course wanted to be with the master, but the time had not yet come and the investigation of the legendary master would shake the entire city. And the city's top leadership would definitely take measures against them, and she would like to find out some information from the master. Rose explained that at the moment, the only enemy is the elite center, and if she leaves now, the capital will also join them, and she does not want to put pressure on the master's enemies for the sake of satisfying her whims. Li Haran replied that in that case, she would have to ensure the security of the Forbidden One herself. But if anything happened, she could always turn to the master for help, and he would cover for her. Meanwhile, in a private nursing home, the man struggled with the symptoms of his illness. It was the president of the elite center, the legendary evolutionist Yu. He thought that this was not the time to relax and that he should quickly return to the center. A few days later, the news of the legendary Master Wu's death spread throughout the city. Returning to the elite center, the president was saddened when he learned of his son's death. He wanted to take revenge. Through the association, he gathered the most influential people of the city and brought them to the meeting. The man stated that the goal was to gather all the best evolutionists in the city to form an elite squad to avenge his son. However, he was immediately objected to, saying that high-level evolutionists are a valuable resource that affects the survival of all layers of the population, so it is definitely impossible to throw them all into one place for the sake of revenge. However, one of the participants said that they occupy a high position and naturally consider it their duty to protect the city, so his guild will bring all efforts to set traps for this beast. A woman from the capital said that she was at the place where the battle took place and did not find a drop of the beast's blood, which means that its power is great and it has at least the power of the 8th or even 9th order. After that, she looked at the president of the elite center and added that only the subordinates of the elite center died at his hands, and perhaps he was simply targeting him. The girl in glasses said that they had too little information about the beast and the risk of a thoughtless attack was too great. So she decided to report to the association's headquarters and ask 2 more evolutionists for help. But until that time, she would not act recklessly. The president immediately stood up and declared that this would take too long and that action must be taken right now. However, the girl ordered him to go home and gain strength. Meanwhile, Li Horan was in the forest and thought that he didn't have much time left and needed to use every opportunity to become stronger before the city's evolutionists found him. And first he needed to achieve the full affection of his subordinates and unlock mysterious rewards and exclusive equipment. With these thoughts, he summoned Banshee. The girl looked around and said that this place did not look like the battlefield. So why did the master call the servant to such a remote place? Lee Haran extended his hand to her and said that he just wanted her to take a walk with him, because they had a long, sleepless night ahead of them. The girl looked at her master with embarrassment and asked, "Does he really want to have sex?"